A Style in Treason by James Blish. Originally published in the May 1970 issue of Galaxy magazine, which had a French translation a year later. It appeared in 4 collections of the author's stories: Anywhen in 1970, Midsummer Century in 1974, The Best of James Blish in 1979, and Works of Art in 2008. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel Quasar Spectra. A Style in Treason. 1. The Karas, a fragile transship. She was really little more than a fairy, just barely meriting a name, came fluttering out of the interstitium into the Floss Campi system a day late in a ball of rainbows, trailing behind her 2 gaudy contrails of false photons, like a moth unable to free herself of her cocoon. The ship's calendar said it was Yoni 23, 5914, which was probably wrong by at least 10 years. However, nobody but a scholar of that style of dating could have been precise about the matter. The Karas was a day later than she should have been. Just what day was, at best, only a local convention. In the salon, Simon de Kyle sighed and laid out the tarots again. Boudica, the biggish 4th planet of the Floss Campi array, and Simon's present port of call, was yet a week ahead in Earthspace, and he was already tired. He had reasons. His fellow passengers had been dull beyond belief, with the possible, because wholly unknown, exception of the entity who had spent the entire voyage in his cabin, with a diplomatic seal spidered over the palm plate on its door. And Simon suspected that they would have bored him even had he not had to present himself to them as a disillusioned Sagittarian mystic, embittered at himself for ever having believed that the mystery that lay, or didn't lie, at the galactic center would someday emerge and set the rest of the universe to rights, and hence in too unpredictable a temper to be worth being polite to. Conceivably, indeed probably, some of the other passengers were trying to be as repellent to strangers as was Simon, but the probability did not make their surfaces any more diverting. But of course, none of these things, the ship, the delay, the passengers, the pose, was more than marginally to blame for his weariness. In these days of treason, politeness, easy travel, and indefinitely prolonged physical vigor, everyone was tired, just a little, but all the time. After a while, it became difficult to remember who one was supposed to be, and to remember who one was virtually impossible. Even the baptized, who had had their minds dipped and then rechanneled with only a century's worth of memories, betrayed to the experienced eye a vague, tortured puzzlement, as though still searching in the stilled waters for some salmon of ego they had been left no reason to suspect had ever been there. Suicide was unconcealedly common among the baptized, and Simon did not think the reason, as the theoreticians and ministers insisted, was really only a minor imperfection in the process, to be worked out in time. There was plenty of time. That was the trouble. People lived too damn long. That was all. Erasing the marks, on the face or in the mind, did not unwind the years. The arrow of entropy pointed forever in the same direction. Virginity was a fact, not just a state of membrane or memory. Helen, reawakening in Aethra's Egyptian bed, flensed of her history, might bemuse Menelaus for a while, but there will always be another Paris, and that without delay. Time past is eternally in time present, as Ezra Tse had said. The 10,000-year-old analogy came easily to him. He was supposed to be, and in fact was, a native of High Earth, and in his persona as a Sagittarian lapsed, would be expected to be a student of such myths. The more time-dimmed, the better. Hence, in fact, his interminable shipboard, not quite game of tarot solitaire. Staying quite automatically in character was his nature, as well as being one of his chiefest skills. And certainly he had never allowed himself to be baptized, though his mind had been put through not a few lesser changes in the service of High Earth, and might yet be forced into a greater one if his mission on Boudica went awry. Many of his memories were painful, and all of them were painfully crowded together, but they were his, and that above all was what gave them their worth. Some professional traders were valuable because they had never had, and never could have, a crisis of identity. Simon knew, without vanity, it was too late for that High Earth had no more distinguished a trader than he, precisely because he had such crises as often as once a year, and hadn't lost one yet. "Your indulgence, Reverend Sir," said a voice at his back. A white hand, well kept but almost aggressively masculine, came over his shoulder and moved the fool onto the falling tower. "It is boorish of me to intervene, but it discomforts me to see an implication go a-begging. I fear I am somewhat compulsive." The voice was a new one, therefore belonging to the person who had been sequestered in the diplomatic cabin up to now. Simon turned, ready to be surly. His next impulse was to arise and run. The question of who the creature was evaporated in recognition of just what it was. Superficially, he saw a man with a yellow page-boy coiffure, wearing pale violet hose, short russet breeches, and a tabard of deeper violet, as well as a kangaroo shiv, a weapon usually affected only by ladies. A duplicate of the spider on the door seal was emblazoned in gold on his left breast. Superficially, for Simon was fortunate, in no way could he explain, to be able to penetrate this seeming. The diplomat was a vombis, or what in those same myths Simon had been thinking of earlier was called a proteus, a creature which could imitate perfectly almost any life form within its size range, or nearly perfectly. For Simon, like one in perhaps 5,000 of his colleagues, was sensitive to them, without ever being able to specify in what particular their imitations of humanity were deficient. Other people, even those of the sex opposite to the one the vombis had assumed, could find no flaw in them, in part because they did not revert when killed. No human had ever seen their real form, if they had one, though of course there were legends aplenty. The talent might have made them ideal double agents had it been possible to trust them, but that was only an academic speculation, since the vombis were wholly creatures of the green exarch. Simon's third impulse, like that of any other human being in like circumstances, was to kill this one instantly upon recognition, but that course had too many obvious drawbacks, of which the kangaroo shiv was the least important. Instead, he said with only moderate ungraciousness, "No matter, I was blocked anyhow. You are most kind. May I be seated, since you're here? Thank you." The creature sat down gracefully across the table from Simon. "Is this your first trip to Boudica, Reverend Sir?" Simon had not said he was going to Boudica, but after all it was written on the passenger list for anyone to see. "Yes, and you?" "Oh, that is not my destination. I am for deeper into the cluster, but you will find it an interesting world, especially the variations in the light. They make it seem quite dreamlike to a native of a planet with only a single stable sun. And then, too, it is very old. What planet isn't? I forget. You are from high Earth, to whom all other worlds must seem young indeed. Nevertheless, Boudica is quite old, enough to have many curious nations, all fiercely independent, and a cultural pattern which overrides all local variations. To this, all the Boudicans are intensely loyal. I commend them, Simon said, and then added sourly, "It is well for a man to have a belief he can cling to." "The point is well taken," said the Vombis. "Yet the pride of Boudica springs from disloyalty in the last analysis. The people believe it was the first colony to break with old Earth back in the first days of the imaginary drive. It is a breach they mean to see remains unhealed." "Why not?" Simon said, shrugging. "I'm told also that Boudica is very wealthy." "Oh, excessively. It was once a great temptation to raiders, but the nations banded together against them with great success. Yet surely wealth does not interest you, Reverend Sir?" "Marginally, yes. I am seeking some quiet country in which to settle and study. Naturally, I should prefer to find myself a patron." "Naturally. I would suggest, then, that you try the domain of the Rude Prince. It is small and stable, the climate is said to be clement, and he has a famous library." The creature arose. "For your purposes, I would avoid Druid's Fall. Life there, as in most large cities, might prove rather turbulent for a scholar. I wish you success, Reverend Sir." Placing its hand formally upon the jeweled shiv, the creature bowed slightly and left. Simon remained staring down at his cards, thinking icily but at speed. What had all that meant? First of all, that his cover had been broken? Simon doubted that, but in any event it mattered little, since he would go almost into the open directly after landing. Assuming that it had, then, what had the creature been trying to convey? Surely not simply that life in Druid's Fall would be even more turbulent for a traitor than for a lapsed divine. Naturally, it would expect Simon to know that. After all, Druid's Fall was the center of the treason industry on Boudica. That was why Simon was going there. Or was it that Boudica would be difficult for an ordinary trader to buy, or was not for sale at all? But that might be said of any worthwhile planet, and no professional would let such a reputation pass without testing it, certainly not on the unsupported word of a stranger. Besides, Simon was, after all, no ordinary trader, nor even the usual kind of double agent. His task was to buy Boudica while seeming to sell high earth. But beyond that, there was a grander treason in the making for which the combined traders' guilds of both planets might only barely be sufficient. The toppling of the Green Exarch, under whose subtle, non-human yoke half of humanity's worlds had not even the latter-day good sense to groan. For such a project, the wealth of Boudica was a prerequisite, for the Green Exarch drew tithes from 6 fallen empires older than man. The wealth of Boudica and its reputation, which the Vombis had invoked as the first colony to have broken with old Earth. And such a project would necessarily be of prime interest to a creature of the Exarch, yet security on it could not possibly have been broken. Simon knew well that men had died horribly for traveling under such assumptions in the past. Nevertheless, he was sure of it. Then what? A steward walked slowly through the salon, beating a gong, and Simon put the problem aside for the moment and gathered up his cards. Druid's Fall. 1 hour to Druid's Fall. All passengers for the Floss Campi system, please prepare for departure. Druid's Fall in 1 hour. Next port of call is Fluority. The fool, he thought, had come to the broken tower. The next card to turn might well be the Hanged Man. 2. Boudica proved indeed to be an interesting world, and despite all of Simon's preliminary reading and conditioning, quite as unsettling as the Vombis had predicted. Its sun, Floss Campi, was a 90-minute microvariable, twinned at a distance of 1 light-year with a blue-white Rigel-like star, which stood, or had stood throughout historical times, in high southern latitudes. This meant that every spot on the planet had a different cycle of day and night. Druid's Fall, for example, had only 4 consecutive hours of quasi-darkness at a time, and even during this period the sky was indigo rather than black at its deepest, and more often than not flaring with auroras, thanks to the almost incessant solar storms. Everything in the city, as everywhere on Boudica, bespoke the crucial importance of fugitive light and the fade-out, fade-in weather that went with it, all very strange after the desert glare of high earth. The day after the Karas had fluttered down had dawned in mist, which cold gales had torn away into slowly pulsating sunlight. Then had come clouds and needle-like rain, which had turned to snow and then to sleet, more weather in a day than the minarets of Jeddah, Simon's registered hometown, saw in a 6-month. The fluctuating light and wetness was reflected most startlingly by its gardens, which sprang up when one's back was turned and did not need so much to be weeded as actually fought. They were constantly in motion to the 90-minute solar cycle, battering their elaborate flower heads against back walls, which were everywhere crumbling after centuries of such soft, implacable impacts. Half the buildings in Druid's Fall glistened with their leaves, which were scaled with so much soft gold that they stuck to anything they were blown against. The wealth of Boudica was based anciently in the vast amounts of uranium and other power metals in its soil, from which the plants extracted the inevitable associated gold as radiation shielding for their spuriously tender genes. Everyone one saw in the streets of Druid's Fall, or any other such city, was a mutation of some sort. If he was not an outworlder, but after a few days in the winds, they were all half yellow, for the gold scales smeared off the flying leaves like butter. Everyone was painted with meaningless riches. The very bed-sheets glittered ineradicably with flakes of it, and brunettes, especially among the elaborate hairstyles of the men, were at a premium. Druid's Fall proper was the usual low jumble of decayed masonry, slightly less ancient slums, and blank-faced offices, but the fact that it was also the home city of the Guild, hence wholly convenient, if not congenial, for Simon, gave it character. The traders had an architectural style of their own, characterized by structures put together mostly of fragmented statues and petrified bodies fitted to each other like puzzle pieces or maps. Traders on Boudica had belonged to an honored social class for 700 years, and their edifices made it known. So did their style of dealing. Simon attended upon the planet's trader-in-chief with all due promptness, wearing the clasp which showed him to be a brother, though an outworlder, and made himself and his errand known with almost complete truthfulness, certainly much more than custom would have demanded. His opposite number, Valcol the Polite, a portly, jowly man in a black abba decorated only with the clasp, with a kindly and humorous expression into which were set eyes like two bites of an iceberg, turned him out of the Guildhall with only as much courtesy as fraternal protocol strictly required, that is, 12 days to get off the planet. Thus far, at least, the Vombis had proven to be right about the Boudiccains, to the letter. The spirit remained to be tested. Simon found an inn in which to lick his wounds and prepare for departure, as was permitted. Of course, he had no intention of leaving. He was simply preparing to go to ground. Nevertheless, he had wounds to lick. After only 4 clockless days on Boudica, he had already been driven into changing his residence, his methods, and his identity. It was a humiliating beginning. 3. Methods next. Listening automatically for the first sound of possible interruption, Simon emptied his little poisons into the catch basin in his new room and ironically watched the wisps of wine-colored smoke rise from the corroded maw of the drain. He was sorry to see them go. They were old, though venomous, friends, but a man's methods can be as telltale as a thumbprint, and now it would have to be assumed that Valcol had sent for and would soon receive some sort of dossier on Simon. The dossier would be wrong, but there was no predicting wherein it would be wrong. Hence, out with the poisons and all their cousins among Simon's apparatus. When assuming a new identity, the very first rule is strip. The almost worn-away maker's legend on the catch basin read, Julius Boudica. Things made on this planet were usually labeled that, generally, as though any place in the world were like any other, but this was both true and not true. Druid's Fall was unmistakable Boudiccan, but as the central city of the traders, it was also distinctly itself. Those buildings, with their curtain walls of petrified corpses, for instance. Luckily, custom now allowed Simon to stay clear of those grim monuments, now that the first disastrous formalities were over, and seek his own bed and breakfast. In the old, disinterestedly friendly inns of Druid's Fall, the anonymous thumps and foreign outcries of the transients, in death, love, or trade, are said to make the regular lodgers start in their beds with their resident gilts. Of course, all inns are like that, but nevertheless, that was why traders liked to quarter there rather than in the traders' halls run by the fraternity. It guaranteed them privacy and at the same time helped them to feel alive. There is undoubtedly something inhibiting about trying to deal within walls pieced together of broken stone limbs, heads, and torsos, some of which had clearly been alive when the foundations were being dug and the scaffolding bolted together. Thus, here in the Scapolamander, Simon could comfortably await his next contact, now that he had dumped his poisons. This, if there was to be one, would of course have to come about before the end of his immunity period. Quarantine was perhaps a more appropriate term. No, the immunity was real, however limited, for as a traitor to High Earth, he had special status. High Earth, the Boudiccains thought, was not necessarily old Earth, but not necessarily not either. For the rest of his 12 days, Simon would not be killed out of sheer conservatism, at least, though nobody official would attempt to deal with him either. He had 8 of those days still to run, a dull prospect, since he had already completed every possible preliminary to going to ground, and spiced only by the fact that he had yet to figure out how long a day might officially be. The rhythms of Floss Campi offered no reliable clues his soul-tuned diurnalism could read. At the moment, there was nothing lighting the window of the room but an aurora, looking like a curtain of orange and hazy blue fire, licking upward along a bone trestle. Radio around here, and probably even electrical power, must be knocked out as much as half the time, with so much stray magnetism washing back and forth. That might prove useful. He filed the thought. In the meantime, there went the last of the poisons. Simon poured water from an amphora into the catch basin, which promptly hissed like a dragon just out of the egg and blurted a mushroom of cold blue steam which made him cough. Careful, he thought. Acid after water, never water after acid. I'm forgetting the most elementary lessons. I should have used wine. Time for a drink in Gross' name. He caught up his cloak and went out, not bothering to lock the door. He had nothing worth stealing but his honor, which was in his right hip pocket. Oh, and of course, high earth. That was in his left. Besides, Boudica was rich. One could hardly turn around without knocking over some heap of treasures, artifacts of a millennium which nobody had sorted for a century, or even wanted to be bothered to sort. Nobody would think to steal from a poor trader any object smaller than a king, or preferably a planet. In the tavern below, Simon was joined at once by a playwoman. "Are you buying tonight, Excellence?" "Why not?" And in fact, he was glad to see her. She was blonde and ample, a relief from the sketchy women of the respectables, whom fashion made look as though they suffered from some nervous disease that robbed them of appetite. Besides, she would exempt him from the normal sort of Boudikian polite conversation, which consisted chiefly of elaborately involuted jokes, at which it was considered gauche to laugh. The whole style of Boudikian conversation, for that matter, was intended to be ignored. Gambits were a high art, but endgames were a lost one. Simon sighed and signaled for beakers. "You wear the trader's clasp," she said, sitting across from him, "but not much tree gold. Have you come to sell us high earth?" Simon did not even blink. He knew the query to be a standard opening with any outworlder of his profession. "Perhaps, but I'm not on business at the moment." "Of course not," the girl said gravely, her fingers playing continuously with a sort of rosary tasseled with 2 silver phalluses. "Yet I hope you prosper. My half-brother is a trader, but he can find only small secrets to sell. How to make bombs and the like. It's a thin life. I prefer mine. Perhaps he should swear by another country. Oh, his country is well worth selling, but his custom is poor. Neither buyer nor seller trusts him very far. A matter of style, I suppose. He'll probably wind up betraying some colony for 1,000 beans in a fishball." "You dislike the man, or is it the trade?" Simon said. "It seems not unlike your own, after all. One sells something one never really owned, and yet one still has it when the transaction is over, as long as both parties keep silent." "You dislike women," the girl said, tranquilly, as a simple observation, not a challenge. "But all things are loans, not just chastity and trust. Why be miserly? To possess wealth is as illusory as to possess honor or a woman, and much less gratifying. Spending is better than saving." "But there are rank orders in all things, too," Simon said, lighting a keef stick. He was intrigued in spite of himself. Hedonism was the commonest of philosophies in the civilized galaxy, But it was piquant to hear a playwoman trotting out the moldy cliches with such fierce solemnity. Otherwise, we should never know the good from the bad, or care. Do you like boys? No, that's not one of my tastes. You will say that I don't condemn boy lovers and that values are in the end only preferences. I think not. In morals, empathy enters in, eventually. So, you wouldn't corrupt children and torture revolts you. But you were made that way. Some men are not so handicapped. I meet them now and then. The hand holding the looped beads made a small, unconscious gesture of revulsion. I think they are the handicapped, not I. Most planets hang their moral imbeciles sooner or later. But what about treason? You didn't answer that question. My throat was dry, thank you. Treason, well, it's an art, hence, again, a domain of taste or preference. Style is everything. That's why my half-brother is so inept. If taste changed, but he might prosper, as I might had I been born with blue hair. You could dye it. What, like the respectables? She laughed, briefly but unaffectedly. I am what I am. Disguises don't become me. Skills, yes, those are another matter. I'll show you when you like, but no masks. Skills can betray you too, Simon thought, remembering that moment at the Traders' Guild when his proud sash of poison shells, offered in service, had lost him in an instant every inch of altitude over the local professionals that he had hoped to trade on. But he only said again, "Why not?" It would be as good a way as any to while away the time, and once his immunity had expired, he could never again trust a playwoman on Boudica. She proved, indeed, very skillful, and the time passed, but the irregular pseudo-days. The clock in the tavern was on a different time than the one in his room, and neither even faintly agreed with his high earth-based chronometer and metabolism, betrayed him. He awoke one morning noon-night to find the girl turning slowly black beside him in the last embrace of a fungal toxin he would have reserved for the emperor or of Canis Venatici, or the worst criminal in human history. His immunity period was up, and war had been declared. He had been notified that if he still wanted to sell High Earth, he would first have to show his skill at staying alive against the whole cold malice of all the traders of Boudica. 4. How the Exarchy or the pre-human interstellar empires were held together is unknown, but in human history at least, the bureaucratic problems of managing large stellar holdings from a single center of government have proven to be insoluble. Neither the ultrophone nor the imaginary drive permitted the extension of human hegemony over a radius of more than 10 light years, a fact the colonies outside this sphere were not slow to appreciate and put to use. Luckily, a roughly uniform interstellar economy was maintained by tacit agreement after the political separations, since it was not widely recognized then, or now, that this much older invention can enforce a more thorough rule than can any personal or party autocracy. In this connection, one often hears laymen ask, why do the various worlds and nations employ professional traders when it is known that they are traders? Why would they confide to the traders any secret valuable enough to be sold to a third party? The answer is the same, and the weapon is the same. Money. The traders act as brokers in a continuous interstellar bourse on which each planet seeks to gain a financial advantage over the other. Thus, The novice should not imagine that any secret put into his hands is exactly what it is said to be, particularly when its primary value purports to be military. Should he also be wary of the ruler who seeks to subvert him into personal loyalty, which tears the economic tissue and hence should be left in the domain of untrained persons? For the professional, loyalty is a tool, not a value. The typical layman's question cited above should, of course, never be answered. This from the writings of Lord Grow. The Discourses, Book 1, Chapter 57. Simon holed up quickly and drastically, beginning with a shot of transduction serum, an almost insanely dangerous expedient, for the stuff not only altered his appearance, but his very heredity, leaving his head humming with false memories and false traces of character, derived from the unknowable donors of the serum, which conflicted not only with his purposes, but even with his tastes and motives. Under interrogation, he would break down into a babbling crowd of random voices, as bafflingly scrambled as his karyotypes, blood groups, and retina and fingerprints. To the eye, his gross physical appearance would be a vague, characterless blur of many roles, some of them derived from the DNA of persons who had died 100 years ago and at least that many parsecs away in space. But unless he got the anti-serum within 15 high Earth days, he would forget his first mission, then his skills, and at last his very identity. Nevertheless, he judged that the risk had to be taken, for effete though some of the local traders, always excepting Valcol the Polite, seemed to be, they were obviously quite capable of penetrating any lesser cover, and actually, obviously, they meant business. The next problem was how to complete the mission itself. It would not be enough just to stay alive. High Earth did not petrify failed traders and mortar them into walls, but it had its own ways of showing displeasure. Moreover, Simon felt to High Earth a certain obligation, not loyalty, Grow forbid, but, well, call it professional pride, which would not let him be retired from the field by a backwater like Boudica. Besides, finally, he had old reasons for hating the Exarchy, and hatred, unaccountably, Grow had forgotten to forbid. No, it was not up to Simon to escape the Boudiccaeans. He had come here to gull them, whatever they might currently think of such a project. And therein lay the difficulty, for Boudica, beyond all other colony worlds, had fallen into a kind of autumn cannibalism, in defiance of that saying of Ezra Tse, the edge was attempting to eat the center. It was this worship of independence, or rather of autonomy, which had not only made treason respectable, but had come nigh unto ennobling it, and was now imperceptibly emasculating it, like the statues one saw everywhere in Druid's Fall, which had been defaced and sexually mutilated by the gray disease of time and the weather. Today, though all the Boudiccaeans proper were colonials in ancestry, they were snobs about the planet's pre-human history, as though they had not merely exterminated the Aborigines themselves, but were their inheritors. The few shambling charioteers who still lived stumbled through the streets of Druid's Fall, loaded with ritual honors, carefully shorn of real power, but ostentatiously deferred to on the slightest occasion which might be noticed by anyone from high Earth. In the meantime, the Boudiccaeans sold each other out with delicate enthusiasm, but against high Earth, which was not necessarily old Earth, but not necessarily not either. All gates were formally locked. Formally only. Simon and high Earth were sure, for the hunger of treason, like lechery, tends to grow with what it feeds on, and to lose discrimination in the process. Boudica, like all forbidden fruits, should be ripe for the plucking, for the man with the proper key to its neglected garden. The key that Simon had brought with him, that enormous bribe which should have unlocked Valcol the Polite like a child's bank, was temporarily useless. He would have to forge another with whatever crude tools could be made to fall to hand. The only one accessible to Simon at the moment was the dead playwoman's despised half-brother. His name, Simon had found out from her easily enough, was currently Daoud Tam Altar, and he was court trader to a small religious principate on the Gulf of the Rood, on the incontinent, half the world away from Druid's Fall. Remembering what the Vombis aboard the Karas had said about the library of the Rood Prince, Simon again assumed the robes of a worn-out Sagittarian divine in search of a patron, confident that his face, voice, stance, and manner were otherwise utterly unlike his shipboard persona, and boarded the flyer to the incontinent, prepared to enjoy the trip. There was much to enjoy. Boudica was a good-sized world, nearly 10,000 miles in diameter, and it was rich in more than money. Ages of weathering and volcanism had broken it into many ecological enclaves, further diversified by the point-by-point uniqueness of climate, contributed to each by the rhythmic inconsistencies of Flos Campi and the fixity of Flos Campi's companion sun among the other fixed stars, and by the customs and colors of many waves of pioneers who had settled in those enclaves and sought to reestablish their private visions of the earthly paradise. It was an entirely beautiful world. Could one but forget one's personal troubles long enough to really look at it? And the flyer flew low and slow, a procedure Simon approved, despite the urgency the transduction serum was imposing upon the back of his mind. Once landed by the Gulf, however, Simon again changed his plans and his outermost disguise, for inquiry revealed that one of the duties of the court trader here was that of singing the Rood Prince to sleep to the accompaniment of the sareh, a sort of gleeman's harp, actually a charioteer instrument, ill-adapted to human fingers, which Daoud played worse than most of the Boudicans who affected it. Simon therefore appeared at the vaguely bird-shaped palace of the Rood Prince in the guise of a ballad merchant, and as such was enthusiastically received and invited to catalogue the library. Daoud, the Rood Prince, said would help him, at least with the music. Simon was promptly able to sell Daoud 12 and a tilly of ancient high earth songs Simon had made up overnight. Faking folk songs is not much of a talent, and had Daoud's confidence within an hour. It was as easy as giving Turkish delight to a baby. He cinched the matter by throwing in free lessons on the traditional way to sing them. After the last mangled chord had died, Simon asked Daoud quietly, "By the way, well sung, Excellence. Did you know that the guild has murdered your half-sister?" Daoud dropped the imitation charioteer harp with a noise like a spring-driven toy coming unwound. "Jalith? But she was only a playwoman. Why, in Gro's name—" Then Daoud caught himself and stared at Simon with sudden, belated suspicion. Simon looked back, waiting. "Who told you that?" "Damn you! Are you a torturer?" "I'm not. I've done nothing to merit—" "I'm not a torturer, and nobody told me," Simon said. "She died in my bed, as a warning to me." He removed his clasp from under the shoulder of his cloak and clicked it. The little machine flowered briefly into a dazzling actinic glare, and then closed again. While Daoud was still covering his steaming eyes, Simon said softly, I am the traitor-in-chief of High Earth." It was not the flash of the badge that was dazzling Daoud now. He lowered his hands. His whole narrow body was trembling with hatred and eagerness. "What? What do you want of me, Excellence? I have nothing to sell but the rude prince, and a poor stick he is. Surely you would not sell me High Earth. I am a poor stick myself." "I would sell you High Earth for 20 reals. "You mock me." "No, Daoud. I came here to deal with the guild, but they killed Gillif, and that, as far as I'm concerned, disqualified them from being treated as civilized professionals or as human beings at all. She was pleasant and intelligent, and I was fond of her. And besides, while I'm perfectly willing to kill under some conditions, I don't hold with throwing away an innocent life for some footling dramatic gesture." "I wholly agree," Daoud said. His indignation seemed to be at least half real. "But what will you do? What can you do?" "I have to fulfill my mission, anyway short of my own death. If I die, nobody will be left to get it done. But I'd most dearly love to cheat, dismay, disgrace the guild in the process, if it could possibly be managed. I'll need your help. If we live through it, I'll see to it that you'll turn a profit, too. Money isn't my first goal here, or even my second now." "I'll tackle it," Daoud said at once, though he was obviously apprehensive, as was only sensible. "What precisely do you propose?" "First of all, I'll supply you with papers indicating that I've sold you a part, not all, of the major thing I have to sell, which gives any man who holds it a lever in the state ministry of High Earth. They show that High Earth has been conspiring against several major powers, all human, for purposes of gaining altitude with the Green Exarch. They won't tell you precisely which worlds, but there will be sufficient information there so that the Exarchy would pay a heavy purse for them, and High Earth an even heavier one to get them back. It will be your understanding that the missing information is also for sale, but you haven't got the price. Suppose the guild doesn't believe that?" "They'll never believe. Excuse me, I must be blunt. That you could have afforded the whole thing. They'll know I sold you this much of it only because I have a grudge, and you can tell them so, though I wouldn't expose the nature of the grudge if I were you. Were you unknown to them, they might assume that you were me in disguise, but luckily they know you and, probably tend rather to underestimate you." "Kindly put," Daoud said with a grin, "but that won't prevent them from assuming that I know your whereabouts or have some way of reaching you. They'll interrogate for that, and of course I'll tell them. I know them too. It would be impossible not to, and I prefer to save myself needless pain." "Of course. Don't risk interrogation at all. Tell them you want to see me out, as well as the secret. That will make sense to them, and I think they must have rules against interrogating a member who offers to sell. Most traders' guilds do." "True, but they'll observe them only so long as they believe me. That's standard, too." Simon shrugged. "Be convincing, then," he said. "I have already said that this project will be dangerous. Presumably, you didn't become a trader solely for sweet safety's sake." "No, not for suicides either. But I'll abide the course. Where are the documents?" "Give me access to your prince's toposcope scriber, and I'll produce them. But first, 20 reals, please." "Minus 2 reals for the use of the prince's property. Bribes, you know." "Your sister was wrong. You do have style, in a myopic sort of way. All right, 18 reals, and then let's get on to real business. My time is not my own, not by a century." "But how do I reach you thereafter?" "That information Simon said blandly, will cost you those other 2 reals, and cheap at the price. 5. The rude prince's brain dictation laboratory was very far from being up to guild standards, let alone high earth's, but Simon was satisfied that the documents he generated there would pass muster. They were utterly authentic, and every experienced traitor had a feeling for that quality, regardless of such technical deficiencies as blurry image registration or irrelevant emotional overtones. That done, he set himself in earnest to the task he had already been playing at, that of cataloging the rude prince's library. He could hardly run out on this without compromising Daoud, as well as drawing unwanted attention to himself. Happily, the chore was pleasant enough. In addition to the usual pornography, the prince owned a number of books Simon had long wanted to see, including the complete text of Villar's The Apples of Idun, and all 200 cantos of Mordecai Drover's The Drum Major and the Mask, with the fabulous tipped-in Brock woodcuts, all hand-tinted. There were sculptures by Laboure and Halverson, and among the music there was the Last Sonata of Andrew Carr. All of this embedded, as was inevitable, in vast masses of junk. But of what library, large or small, might that not be said? Whether or not the rude prince had taste, he certainly had money, and some of it, under some past librarian, had been well spent. In the midst of all this, Simon had also to consider how he would meet Daoud when the game had that much furthered itself. The arrangement he had made with the playwoman's half-brother had, of course, been a blind, indeed a double blind, but it had to have the virtues of its imperfections. That is, to look as though it had been intended to work, and to work, in fact, up to a certain point, or nothing would be accomplished, and it would then have to be bailed out of its inbuilt fatalities. But Simon was now beginning to find it hard to think. The transduction serum was increasingly taking hold, and there were treasons taking place inside his skull which had nothing at all to do with Daoud, the Rude Prince, Druid's Fall, Boudica, the Green Exarch, or High Earth. Worse, they seemed to have nothing to do with Simon de Kyle either, but instead muttered away about silly little provincial intrigues nothing could have brought him to care about, yet which made him feel irritated, angry, even ill, like a man in the throes of jealousy towards some predecessor and unable to reason them away. Knowing their source, he fought them studiously, but he knew they would get steadily worse, however resolute he was. They were coming out of his genes and his bloodstream, not his once finely honed, now dimming consciousness. Under the circumstances, he was not going to be able to trust himself to see through very many highly elaborate schemes, so that it would be best to eliminate all but the most necessary. Hence it seemed better, after all, to meet Daoud in the Principate as arranged, and save the double-dealing for more urgent occasions. On the other hand, it would be foolish to hang around the Principate, waiting and risking some miscarriage, such as betrayal through a possible interrogation of Daoud, when there were things he might be accomplishing elsewhere. Besides, the unvarying foggy warmth and the fragmented, garish religiousness of the Principate both annoyed him and exercised pulls of conflicting enthusiasms and loyalties on several of his mask personalities, who had apparently been as unstable even when whole as their bits and pieces had now made him. He was particularly out of sympathy with the motto graven on the lintel of the Rude Prince's palace: "Justice is love." The sentiment, obviously descended from some colonial Islamic sect, was excellent doctrine for a culture knit together by treason, for it allowed the prosecution of almost any kind of betrayal on the grounds that justice, disguised as that kind of love which says, I'm doing this for your own good. It hurts me more than it does you," was being pursued. But Simon, whose dimly remembered parents had betrayed him often on just those grounds, found it entirely too pat. Besides, he was suspicious of all abstractions which took the form A is B. In his opinion, neither justice nor mercy were very closely related to love, let alone being identical with it. Otherwise, why have 3 words instead of 1? A metaphor is not a tautology. These bagatelles aside, it seemed likely to Simon that something might be gained by returning for a while to Druid's Fall and haunting the vicinity of the Guildhall. At the worst, his address would then be unknown to Daoud, and his anonymity more complete in the larger city, the Guild less likely to identify him even were it to suspect him, as of course it would, of such boldness. At best, he might pick up some bit of useful information, particularly if Daoud's embassy were to create any unusual stir. Very well. Presenting the Rude Prince with a vast stack of punched aperture cards and a promise to return, Simon took the flyer to Druid's Fall, where he was careful to stay many miles away from the Scopolomander. For a while he saw nothing unusual, which was in itself fractionally reassuring. Either the Guild was not alarmed by Daoud's clumsy proposals, or was not letting it show. On several days in succession, Simon saw the Bodikian traitor-in-chief enter and leave, sometimes with an entourage, more often with only a single slave. Everything seemed normal, although it gave Simon a small, ambiguous frisson, which was all the more disturbing because he was unsure which of his personae he should assign it to. Certainly not to his fundamental self, for although Valcol was here, the predestined enemy, he was no more formidable than others Simon had defeated, while it was true, being in his whole and right mind. Then Simon recognized the slave, and this time he did run. It was the Vombis, the same one who had been traveling as a diplomat aboard the Karas. The creature had not even bothered to change its face to fit its new role. This time he could have killed the creature easily from his point of vantage, and probably gotten away clean, but again, there were compelling reasons for not doing so. Just ridding the universe of one of the protean entities, if it did any good at all, for nobody knew how they reproduced, would be insufficient advantage for the hue and cry that would result. Besides, the presence of an agent of the Exarchy so close to the heart of this imbroglio was suggestive and might be put to some use. Of course, the Vombis might be in Druid's Fall on some other business entirely, or simply paying a courtesy call on its way back from deeper into the cluster. But Simon would be in no hurry to make so dangerous an assumption. No, it was altogether more likely that the Exarch, who could hardly have heard yet of Simon's arrival and disgrace, was simply aware in general of how crucial Boudica would be to any scheme of high earths. He was above all an efficient tyrant, and had placed his creature here to keep an eye on things. Yes, that situation might be used, if Simon could just keep his disquietingly percolating brains under control. Among his present advantages was the fact that his disguise was better than that of the Vombis, a fact the creature had probably been made constitutionally incapable of suspecting by the whole thrust of its evolution. With a grim chuckle, which he hoped he would not later be forced to swallow, Simon flew back to the Gulf of the Rude. 6. Daoud met Simon in the Singing Gardens, a huge formal maze not much frequented of late, even by lovers, because the Rude Prince, in the throes of some new religious crotchet, had let it run wild, so that one had constantly to be fending off the ardor of the flowers. At best, this made even simple conversations difficult, and it was rumored that deep in the heart of the maze, the floral attentions to visitors were of a more sinister sort. Daoud was exultant, indeed almost manic in his enthusiasm, which did not advance comprehension either, but Simon listened patiently. "They bought it like lambs," Daoud said, naming a sacrificial animal of high earth so casually as to make one of Simon's personae shudder inside him. "I had a little difficulty with the underlings, but not as much as I'd expected, and I got it all the way up to Valcol himself." "No sign of any outside interest?" "No, nothing. I didn't let out any more than I had to until I reached his politeness, and after that he put the blue seal on everything. Wouldn't discuss anything but the weather while anyone else was around. Listen, Simon, I don't want to seem to be telling you your business, but I think I may know the guild better than you do. And it seems to me that you're underplaying your hand. This thing is worth money." "I said it was." "Yes, but I don't think you've any conception how much. Old Valcol took my asking price without a murmur. In fact, so fast that I wish I'd asked for twice as much. Just to show you I'm convinced of all this, I'm going to give it all to you." "Don't want it," Simon said. "Money is of no use to me unless I can complete the mission. All I need now is operating expenses, and I've got enough for that." This clearly had been what Daoud had hoped he would say, but Simon suspected that had matters gone otherwise, the younger man might indeed have given over as much as half the money. His enthusiasm mounted. "All right, but that doesn't change the fact that we could be letting a fortune slip here." "How much?" "Oh, at least a couple of mega-reals, and I mean a piece," Daoud said grandly. "I can't imagine an opportunity like that comes around very often, even in the circles you're used to." "What would we have to do to earn it?" Simon said, with carefully calculated doubt. "Play straight with the guild. They want the material badly, and if we don't trick them, we'll be protected by their own rules. And with that much money, there are 100 places in the galaxy where you'd be safe from high earth for the rest of your life." "And what about your half-sister?" "Well, I'd be sorry to lose that chance, but cheating the guild would bring her back, would it? And, in a way, wouldn't it be aesthetically more satisfying to pay them back for Gillith by being scrupulously fair with them? Justice is love, you know, and all that." "I don't know," Simon said fretfully. "The difficulty lies in defining justice, I suppose. You know as well as I do that it can excuse the most complicated treasons. And what do you mean by love isn't easily answerable either. In the end, one has to shuck it off as a woman's question, too private to be meaningful in a man's world, let alone in matters of polity." This maundering served no purpose but to suggest that Simon was still trying to make up his mind. Actually, he had reached a decision several minutes ago. Daoud had broken. He would have to be disposed of. Daoud listened with an expression of polite bafflement, which did not quite completely conceal a gleam of incipient triumph. Ducking a trumpet vine which appeared to be trying to crown him with thorns, Simon added at last, "You may well be right, but we'll have to be mortally careful. There may, after all, be another agent from high earth here. In matters of this importance, they wouldn't be likely to rest with only one charge in the chamber. That means you'll have to follow my instructions to the letter, or we'll never live to spend a real of the proceeds." "You can count on me," Daoud said, tossing his hair out of his eyes. "I've handled everything well enough this time, haven't I? And after all, it was my idea." "Certainly, an expert production. Very well. What I want you to do now is go back to Valcol and tell him that I've betrayed you and sold the other half of the secret to the Rude Prince. Surely you wouldn't actually do such a thing? Oh, but I would, and I shall. The deed will be done by the time you get back to Druid's Fall, and for the same 20 reals that you paid for your half. But the purpose? Simple. I cannot come to Druid's Fall with my remaining half. If there's another Earthman there, I'd be shot before I got halfway up the steps of the hall. I want the guild to consolidate the two halves by what seems to be an unrelated act of aggression between local parties. You make this clear to them by telling them that I won't actually make the sale to the Rude Prince until I hear from you that you have the rest of the money. To get the point across at once, when you tell his politeness that I've betrayed you, wink. And how do I get word to you this time? You wear this ring. It communicates with the receiver in my clasp. I'll take matters from there. The ring, which was actually only a ring, which would never communicate anything to anybody, changed hands. Then Daoud saluted Simon with solemn glee, and went away to whatever niche in history and in the walls of the Guildhall of Boudica is reserved for traders without style. And Simon, breaking the stalk of a lyre bush which had sprung up between his feet, went off to hold his muttering, nattering skull and do nothing at all. 7. Valcol the Polite, or the Exarch's agent, it hardly mattered which, did not waste any time. From a vantage point high up on the Principate's only suitable mountain, Simon watched their style of warfare with appreciation and some wonder. Actually, in the maneuvering itself, the hand of the Exarchy did not show, and did not need to, for the whole campaign would have seemed a token display, like a tournament, had it not been for a few score of casualties, which seemed inflicted almost inadvertently. Even among these there were not many deaths, as far as Simon could tell, at least not by the standards of battle to which he was accustomed. Clearly nobody who mattered got killed, on either side. It all reminded Simon of medieval warfare, in which the nearly naked kerns and gallows-glasses were thrust into the front ranks to slaughter one another, while the heavily armored knights kept their valuable persons well to the rear, except that here there was a good deal more trumpet-blowing than there was slaughter. The Rude Prince, in an exhibition of bravado more garish than sensible, deployed on the plain before his city several thousand pennon-bearing mounted troopers who had nobody to fight but a rabble of foot soldiers, which Druid's Fall obviously, at least to Simon's eye, did not intend to be taken seriously, whereupon the city was taken from the Gulf side by a squadron of flying submarines which broke from the surface of the sea on 4 buzzing wings like so many dragonflies. The effect was like a raid by the 25th century upon the 13th, as imagined by someone in the 20th. A truly dreamlike sensation. The submarines particularly interested Simon. Some bodacious genius, unknown to the rest of the known galaxy, had solved the ornithopter problem, though the wings of the devices were membranous rather than feathered. Hovering, the machines thrummed their wings through a phase shift of a full 180 degrees, but when they swooped, the wings moved in a horizontal figure 8, lifting with a forward and down stroke, and propelling with the back stroke. A long fish-like tail gave stability, and doubtless had other uses underwater. After the mock battle, the thopters landed and the troops withdrew, and then matters took a more sinister turn, manifested by thumping explosions and curls of smoke from inside the Rude Palace. Evidently, a search was being made for the supposedly hidden documents Simon was thought to have sold, and it was not going well. The sounds of demolition and the occasional public hangings could only mean that a maximum interrogation of the rude prince had failed to produce any papers or any clues to them. This Simon regretted, as he did the elimination of Daoud. He was not normally so ruthless. An outside expert would have called his workmanship in this affair perilously close to being sloppy, but the confusion caused by the transduction serum, now rapidly rising as it approached term, had prevented him from manipulating every factor as subtly as he had originally hoped to do. Only the grand design was still intact now. It would now be assumed that Boudica had clumsily betrayed the Exarchy, leaving the guild no way out but to capitulate utterly to Simon, with whatever additional humiliations he judged might not jeopardize the mission, for Gilleth's sake. Something abruptly cut off his view of the palace. He snatched his binoculars away from his eyes in alarm. The object that had come between him and the gulf was a mounted man. Or, rather, the idiot-headed apteryx the man was sitting on. Simon was surrounded by a ring of them, their lance points aimed at his chest, pennons trailing in the dusty viol grass. Someone of Simon's personae remembered that the function of a pennon is to prevent the lance from running all the way through the body, so that the weapon can be pulled out easily and used again, but Simon had more immediate terrors to engross him. The pennons bore the device of the Rude Prince, but every lancer in the force was a vombis. Simon arose resignedly, with a token snarl, intended more for himself than for the impassive protean creatures and their fat birds. He wondered why it had never occurred to him before that the vombis might be as sensitive to him as he was to them. But the answer to that no longer mattered. Sloppiness was about to win its long-postponed reward. 8. They put him naked into a wet cell, a narrow closet completely clad in yellowed alabaster, down the sides of which water oozed and beaded all day long, running out into gutters at the edges. He was able to judge when it was day because there were clouded bullseye lenses in each of the 4 walls which waxed and waned at him with any outside light. By the pattern of its fluctuation he could have figured out to a nicety just where on Boudica he was, had he been in the least doubt that he was in Druid's Fall. The wet cell was a sort of inverted oubliette, thrust high up into Boudica's air, probably a hypertrophied Merlin on one of the towers of the Trader's Hall. At night, a 5th lens, backed by a sodium vapor lamp, glared down from the ceiling, surrounded by a faint haze of steam where the dew tried to condense on it. Escape was a useless fantasy. Erected into the sky as it was, the wet cell did not even partake of the usual character of the building's walls, except for one stain in the alabaster, which might have been the underside of a child's footprint. Otherwise, the veinings were mockingly meaningless. The only exit was down, an orifice through which they had inserted him as though he were being born, and now plugged like the bottom of a stopped toilet. Could he have broken through one of the lenses with his bare hands? He would have found himself naked and torn on the highest point in Druid's Fall, with no place to go. Naked he was. Not only had they pulled all his teeth in search of more poisons, but of course they had also taken his clasp. He hoped they would fool with the clasp. It would make a clean death for everybody. But doubtless they had better sense. As for the teeth, they would regrow if he lived. That was one of the few positive advantages of the transduction serum. But in the meantime, his bare jaws ached abominably. They had missed the antidote, which was in a tiny gel capsule in his left earlobe, masquerading as a sebaceous cyst. left because it is automatic to neglect that side of a man, as though it were only a mirror image of the examiner's right. And that was some comfort. In a few more days now, the gel would dissolve. He would lose his multiple disguise, and then he would have to confess. But in the meantime, he could manage to be content despite the slimy, glaring cold of the cell. And in the meantime, he practiced making virtues of deficiencies, in this instance calling upon his only inner resources, the diverting mutterings of his other personalities, and trying to guess what they might once have meant. Some said, "But I mean, like, where they going? Yeah, let's get out of here, he. Where? So, anyway, others? It's hard not to recognize a pigeon, but Mother's birthday is 20th July. So we knew that the inevitable might happen. It made my scalp creak and my blood curl. Where do you get those crazy ideas? And others. Acquit Socrates. Back when she was saying she was married to a window washer. Well, I don't know what you've got under your skirt, but it's wearing white socks. And then she made a noise like a spin dizzy going sour. And others. Pepe Satan, Alepe. Why, so might any man. Evacuate Mars. And then she says to me, if he would abandon his mind to it, with all of love. But at that point the plug began to unscrew, and from the sparges above him, which formerly had kept the dampness running, a heavy gas began to curl. They had tired of waiting for him to weary of himself, and the second phase of his questioning was about to begin. 9. They questioned him, dressed in a hospital gown so worn that it was more starch than fabric, in the traitor-in-chief's private office to begin with, a deceptively bluff, hearty, leather and piperex sort of room, which might have been reassuring to a novice. There were only two of them, Valcol in his usual abba, and the slave, now dressed as a charioteer of the high blood. It was a curious choice of costume, since charioteers were supposed to be free, leaving it uncertain which was truly master and which slave. Simon did not think it could have been Valcol's idea. The Vombus, he also noticed, still had not bothered to change its face from the one it had been wearing aboard the Karas, implying an utter confidence which Simon could only hope would prove to be unjustified. Noting the direction of his glance, Valcol said, "I asked this gentleman to join me to assure you, should you be in any doubt, that this interview is serious. I presume you know who he is." "I don't know who he is," Simon said with the faintest of emphasis, "but it must be representing the Green Exarch, since it's a Vombus." The traitor-in-chief's lips whitened slightly. Aha, then he hadn't known that. "Prove it," he said. "My dear Valcol," the creature interposed, "pray don't let him distract us over trifles. Such a thing could not be proved without the most elaborate of laboratory tests, as we all know, and the accusation shows what we wish to know, i.e., that he is aware of who I am. Otherwise, why try to make such an inflammatory charge?" "Your master's voice," Simon said. "Let us by all means proceed. This gown is chilly." "This gentleman," Valcol said, exactly as if he had not heard any of the four preceding speeches, "is Chag Sharani of the Exarchy. Not from the embassy, but directly from the court. He is His Majesty's deputy fomentor." "Appropriate," Simon murmured. "We know you now style yourself Simon de Kyle, but what is more to the point than that you claim yourself the traitor-in-chief of High Earth? Documents now in my possession persuade me that if you are not in fact that officer, you are so close to being he as makes no difference. Possibly the man you replaced, the amateur with the absurd belt of poison shells, was actually he. In any event, you are the man we want." "Flattering of you." "Not at all," said Valcol the polite. "We simply want the remainder of those documents for which we paid. Where are they?" "I sold them to the Rood Prince." "He had them not, nor could he be persuaded to remember any such transaction." "Of course not," Simon said with a smile. "I sold them for 20 reals. Do you think the Rood Prince would recall any such piddling exchange? I appeared as a bookseller and sold them to his librarian. I suppose you burned the library. Barbarians always do." Valcol looked at the Vombis. "The price agrees with the, testimony of Daoud Tam Altair. Do you think—" "It is possible, but we should take no chances. E.g., such a search would be time-consuming." The glitter in Valcol's eyes grew brighter and colder. "True. Perhaps the quickest course would be to give him over to the Sodality." Simon snorted. The Sodality was a lay organization to which guilds classically entrusted certain functions the guild lacked time and manpower to undertake, chiefly crude physical torture. "If I am really who you think I am," he said, "such a course would win you nothing but an unattractive cadaver, not even suitable for masonry repair." "True," Valcol said reluctantly. "I don't suppose you could be induced, politely, to deal fairly with us at this later date. After all, we did pay for the documents in question, and not any mere 20 reals." "I haven't the money yet." "Naturally not, since the unfortunate Daoud was held here with it until we decided he no longer had any use for it. However, if upon the proper oaths—" "High Earth is the oldest oath-breaker of them all," the fomenter said. "We, viz. the Exarchy, have no more time for such trials. The question must be put." "So it would seem, though I hate to handle a colleague thus." "You fear High Earth," the Vombis said. "My dear Valcol, may I remind you—" Yes, the Exarch's guarantee. I know all that," Valcol snapped, to Simon's surprise. "Nevertheless, Mr. de Kyle, are you sure we have no recourse but to send you to the Babel Room?" "Why not?" Simon said. "I rather enjoy hearing myself think. In fact, that's what I was doing when your guards interrupted me." 10. Simon was, naturally, far from feeling all the bravado he had voiced, but he had no choice left but to trust to the transduction serum, which now had his mind on the shuddering, giddy verge of depriving all three of them what they each most wanted. Only Simon, of course, could know this, and only he could also know something much worse, that insofar as his increasingly distorted time sense could calculate, the antidote was due to be released into his bloodstream at best in another 6 hours, at worst within only a few minutes. After that, the Exarchy's creature would be the only victor and the only survivor. and when he saw the guild's toposcope laboratory, he wondered if even the serum would be enough to protect him. There was nothing in the least outmoded about it. Simon had never encountered its like, even on high Earth. Exarchy equipment, all too probably. Nor did the apparatus disappoint him. It drove directly down into his subconscious with the resistless unconcern of a spike penetrating a toy balloon. Immediately, a set of loudspeakers above his supine body burst into multi-voiced life. "Is this some trick? No one but Berens had a translation permit. Now the overdrive, my other, must woo and win me. Wir schaffen sie es solche Entfernungen bei Unterlichtgeschwindigkeit zurückzulegen. Remember, 4, 5. Pock, pock, pock. We're so tired of waiting in blood, so tired of drinking blood, so tired of dreaming about blood." The last voice rose to a scream, and all the loudspeakers cut off abruptly. Valkol's face, baffled but not yet worried, hovered over Simon's, peering into his eyes. "We're not going to get anything out of that," he told some invisible technician. "You must have gone too deep. Those are the archetypes you're getting, obviously."
"Nonsense." The voice was the fomenter's. "The archetypes sound nothing like that, for which you should be grateful. In any event, we have barely gone beneath the surface of the cortex. See for yourself."
Valkol's face withdrew. Well, something's wrong. Maybe your probe is too broad. Try it again." The spike drove home, and the loudspeakers resumed their mixed chorus. "Nausen tampen, edet hompik, beropsilom, I'm katsetchok, sam betegom wow. Ditis lui qui lui ordonis de revenir in virtu de la loi de grandeur." Perhaps he should swear by another country. Can't Mommy Ladder spaceship think for bye-bye see you too windy, Daddy bottle seconds straight? Nansima makamba yonso kakosilisa. Stars don't have points. They're round, like balls. The sound clicked off again. Valkol said fretfully, "He can't be resisting. You've got to be doing something wrong, that's all." Though the operative part of his statement was untrue, it was apparently also inarguable to the fomenter. There was quite a long silence, broken only occasionally by small hums and clicks. While he waited, Simon suddenly felt the beginnings of a slow sense of relief in his left earlobe, as though a tiny but unnatural pressure he had long learned to live with had decided to give way, precisely, in fact, like the opening of a cyst. That was the end. Now he had but 15 minutes more in which the toposcope would continue to vomit forth its confusion, its steadily diminishing confusion, and only an hour before even his physical appearance would reorganize, though that would no longer matter in the least. It was time to exercise the last option, now, before the probe could bypass his cortex and again prevent him from speaking his own fully conscious mind. He said, "Never mind, Valkol. I'll give you what you want." "What? By Gro, I'm not going to give you..." "You don't have to give me anything. I'm not selling anything. You see for yourself that you can't get to the material with that machine, nor with any other like it, I may add. But I exercise my option to turn my coat under guild laws. That gives me safe conduct, and that's sufficient."
"No," the fomenter's voice said. "It is incredible. He is in no pain and has frustrated the machine. Why should he yield? Besides, the secret of his resistance..."
"Hush," Valkol said. I am moved to ask if you are a Vombis. Doubtless, the machine would tell us that much. Mr. de Kyle, I respect the option, but I am not convinced yet. The motive, please? High Earth is not enough, Simon said. Remember Ezra say, the last temptation is the final treason, to do the right thing for the wrong reason. I would rather deal fairly with you and then begin the long task of becoming honest with myself. But with you only, Valcol, not the Exarchy. I sold the Green Exarch nothing. I see. A most interesting arrangement, I agree. What will you require? Perhaps 3 hours to get myself unscrambled from the effects of fighting your examination. Then I'll dictate the missing material. At the moment, it's quite inaccessible. I believe that, too, Valcol said ruefully. Very well.
It is not very well, the Vombis said, almost squalling. The arrangement is a complete violation of...
Valcol turned and looked at the creature so hard that it stopped talking of its own accord. Suddenly Simon was sure Valcol no longer needed tests to make up his mind what the fomenter was. I would not expect you to understand it, Valcol said in a very soft voice indeed. It is a matter of style. 11. Simon was moved to a comfortable apartment and left alone for well more than 3 hours he had asked for. By that time his bodily reorganization was complete, though it would take at least a day more for all the residual mental effects of the serum to vanish. When the traitor-in-chief finally admitted himself to the apartment, he made no attempt to disguise either his amazement or his admiration. The Poison Man. High Earth is still a world of miracles. Would it be fair to ask what you did with your, overpopulated associate? I disposed of him, Simon said. We have traitors enough already. There is your document. I wrote it out by hand, but you can have toposcoped confirmation whenever you like now. As soon as my technicians master the new equipment. We shot the monster, of course, though I don't doubt the Exarch will resend it. When you see the rest of the material, you may not care what the Exarch thinks, Simon said. You will find that I've brought you a high alliance, though it was Gross' own horns getting it to you. I had begun to suspect as much. Mr. de Kyle, I must assume you are still he, for sanity's sake. That act of surrender was the most elegant gesture I have ever seen. That alone convinced me that you were indeed the traitor-in-chief of High Earth, and no other. Why, so I was, Simon said, but if you will excuse me now, I think I'm about to become somebody else. With a mixture of politeness and alarm, Valcol left him. It was none too soon. He had a bad taste in his mouth, which had nothing to do with his ordeals, and, though nobody knew better than he how empty all vengeance is, an inexpugnable memory of Gillith. Maybe, he thought, justice is love after all, not a matter of style, but of spirit. He had expected all these questions to vanish when the antidote took full hold, wiped into the past, with the personalities who had done what they had done, but they would not vanish. They were himself. He had won, but obviously he would never be of use to High Earth again. In a way, this suited him. A man did not need the transduction serum to be divided against himself. He still had many guilts to accept, and not much left of a lifetime to do it in. While he was waiting, perhaps he could learn to play the Sarre. You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.